So, can you tell me your name and how old you were in 1968?
My name was still the same. It was Charles Donches. And in 1968, I was 28 years old.
Okay. What were you doing during the Vietnam War? Where did you live? What was your employment status? And who were you living with?
Well, if you're talking just about that time frame,
Yeah.
okay. Because during part of the Vietnam War, I was in the Air Force. But that was earlier. That was from 58 through 62. And in 1968, I was living in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. I was married to your grandmother, because we got married in 1967. So,
Okay.
What was I doing?
Yeah.
What? I was in 1960. I'm not quite sure. I was working for the state of Pennsylvania as an industrial health engineer part of the time, and then I moved up to Bethlehem, and I was working for Bethlehem Steel. So it depends on what time of the year, and I don't remember exactly when that happened.
Okay.
Probably in the summer of 68.
Okay. What was your understanding at the time of why we were in Vietnam?
Well, the primary reason we went there, or what we were told, was that there was concern about the domino theory, that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, then the communists would start to take over all parts of Asia and the Orient, one by one. I think the reason we got into the conflict, or the reason that the Congress allowed the president to send troops over there, was an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. There was one of our ships was attacked by a North Korean ship, and I don't remember. I think it was Gulf of Tonkin resolution or something like that allowed that to happen. But the reason they went over there was to prevent communists from taking over South Vietnam and then the rest of Asia. That's what we were told. That's what the news said. That's what the government said.
Okay. And how has your view of the Vietnam War changed over time? Did you support the war at first and then change, or what?
Well, yeah, because I was in the Air Force at the time, and in fact, I even had orders to go over to Thailand early in the war, and they got changed just before I left, and instead I wound up in Florida. We were monitoring U-2 flights over Cuba. You remember the missile crisis in Cuba? Mm-hmm. That also came up at the time. Well, instead of going to Vietnam, I went there. But being in the military, you kind of just thought that, it was the thing to do. The conflict was there, and we were trying to resolve it. I don't know. I know that a lot of people felt badly about it. There was some concern from the people here who thought that the soldiers who were over there didn't do their job. It's, like America never lost the war before Vietnam, and then they came back from Vietnam and we really hadn't won, and there was a dislike for them. But I never had that attitude. And I was surprised that anyone would have it. It was just that, well, you did a job you were supposed to do, and then when you were done, you were done.
So do you remember seeing like the protests on TV and watching that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of protests. The one that I remember was at Kent State, I believe. And I don't know if there was one or two there, but one or two students, I don't remember the exact number, were killed by the National Guard that were in place. And I think that incident and probably the amount of what would you call it, the demonstrations, I think made President Johnson rethink why we were over there, and that it was probably time for us to get out of there and, and try to save face as best as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember the demonstrations.
How were people you knew affected by the draft, if anyone was affected by the draft that you knew?
Let's see.
Or
well,
did
brother,
anyone you know enlist?
I didn't know many who enlisted. Most of the people I knew who went in were drafted. A good friend of mine spent time over there. Well, several good friends of mine spent time over there and were lucky enough to come back. What do they call it? In country or something like that. They were actually in Vietnam on the ground. They were lucky enough to come back. Some friends who were drafted in Bethlehem, especially, there was a full plane load that crashed with quite a few guys that I knew from high school and from my neighborhood who got killed in a plane crash on their way to wherever.
Okay.
But they had been drafted. What else? My brother got drafted. While he was still in college, and he applied for a kind of a deferment, and they said no, so he enlisted, I guess, he enlisted in the Navy, and the Navy allowed him to finish his master's degree, and then he went in after that and spent, that was Joe, your Uncle Joe, he spent about, I think it was about a year and a half on an aircraft carrier off Vietnam.
Wow. In your opinion, how accurately did the media report on the war? I mean, from what you'd heard from people who were actually there, were they doing a good job, or did you watch any of the news coverage on TV or see it anywhere else?
Yeah, it was funny. Back then, the news was filtered. Obviously, we didn't know it. But everything that came out of Vietnam, any of the national news agencies or services, they were all, you learned this later, you didn't know it then, but at the time you learned that the news that they were bringing back was only good news. They wouldn't show pictures of dead soldiers, they didn't show pictures of the dead civilians. They didn't show the napalm bombing that was going on until much, much later, almost towards the end, when the protests and everything else went crazy. And I don't know how the news came out, whether it was independent guys who were over there taking film and bringing it back, but that's when I think the protests all started, when they started to see what really was going on. Because up until then, all you heard was the good news.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I forget how many people were killed, but it was some outrageous number of soldiers that were killed in that war that we rarely heard about until towards the end. And that's as I recall it. I don't have instant recall, but it was. When you look, I guess that's what caused a lot of the demonstrations too, and the fact that they said the government was lying to us. They said that the war was going well, and it really wasn't going as well as they claimed. And then we all know now what happened, that eventually we got pushed back, and then there was the Tet offensive at the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong started, and I forget what year that was in, but that must have been pretty close to the end of the war, within the last year or two.
Yeah.
And although they would come in and, I guess, attack the towns or the areas and take them, then our forces would drive them back, and all we knew was that they would be driven back, and we didn't really know how bad it was until the very end, when you saw people scrambling to get out of South Vietnam.
What is your opinion on how different presidents and leaders handled the war, like especially Robert McNamara? And did the war change how you felt about the government or our leaders?
I guess McNamara was the architect of the Vietnam War, I guess, if you want to call it that. I didn't, at the time, I really wasn't that tuned into it. I mean, I'd done my time in the service. I came out. I went to school. The only thing I know was that because I was in during Vietnamese era, I got the GI Bill. So I had some benefits from it, and I was able to finish college, without too much debt, if any, because of the loans I had. So I didn't feel badly about it. McNamara, I really didn't have much of an opinion of that. Johnson, I thought, did a tremendous thing. I mean, he finished out Kennedy's term, then he ran and won, and he could have run again because he had only run once.
Mm-hmm.
But he realized that ending the war and bringing the kids back was more important than him being president another 4 years. And so I thought pretty highly of Johnson and the way he ended the whole debacle and, brought as many guys back as he could and just got out of there. It was, I said before, Americans always said, "Oh, you can't quit. You don't run. You can't lose the war. We never lost the war in our life, and or in our history, I should say." But anyway, as far as Johnson, I thought he did a pretty good job. In the beginning, maybe not, but towards the end, when you realize what he was going through, and it's coincidental. I've just been reading a book called The President's Club, and it deals with a lot of how each president and ex-presidents, how they got together. They had this little fraternity that's pretty special. There are only a few guys in it. And it talks about, in there's a lot of discussion about how Johnson called on Eisenhower to help him. Now, at the time, I didn't know it, but I just found out recently that Eisenhower, because of his military background, Johnson used him a lot to help him make decisions, and they became pretty good friends, which was unusual because it was a Democrat and a Republican. But so, from that point of view, those are the only two. I didn't think much of McNamara. I didn't even, you knew he was Secretary of Defense, but that's about it.